Hey guys, what's up? My name's Alec Torelli, and in this video, I'm going to show you the 5 moves you need to know to crush poker in 2019. But before we jump in, we here at Conscious Poker are releasing a ton of new content, engineered to make you a crusher. From high-stakes hand reviews to answering your most pressing questions on all things poker, the Conscious Poker YouTube is for you if you're looking to become the best, most confident player in your game. Our next video will be dropped later this week, so be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you're the first to know when it comes out. For now though, let's jump right in. Here are the 5 moves you need to know to crush poker in 2019. Move number 1, select the right game. You may be thinking, well Alec, that's not technically a move, but in fact it is. Hear me out. Before you even sit down at the table, you must first decide where you're going to play. You may wish to take a step back and reflect on whether you're going to be playing cash games or tournaments, online or live poker, and which format works best for you. Once you've determined that, you want to make sure the game you're playing in a game with weaker players than yourself. Now this may sound obvious, but it's clearly not, because most poker players are still losing. And since your win rate is the difference in skill between you and your opponents, if more players played against worse competition, they wouldn't be losing. Pros won't tell you this because they want you to play in their games, but the truth is this. If you're the 10th best player in the world and you sit in a game with the top 9, you're going to get smashed. And inversely, if you're the 10th worst player in the world, you can still be the shark if you find 9 worse people to play with. So who should game select? Game selection may not be for you if your goal is simply to play more poker, improve at the game, or have fun. If that sounds like you, then by all means, jump right in with the sharks. But if your goal is to win the most money or beat the game selection is everything. Now I understand game selecting may not be practical for you if you don't have many games to play in at your local casino, and I'm empathetic to that, which is why the next steps are going to focus on how to beat whatever game you sit in. Move number 2, the 1/3 size pot bet, sometimes referred to as a down bet. This move is something you may have seen in the streets lately if you've been watching high-stakes poker on TV, but you might be wondering, why bet 1/3 of the pot in the first place? And when is the best time to do it? Well, for starters, betting 1/3 of the pot is a great way to have a good risk-reward on your bet. Since you're only risking 1/3 of the pot with your C-bet, for example, it doesn't have to work all that often for you to show a profit. For example, if the pot is $100 and you bet 33, you only need your opponent to fold 1 out of 4 times for you to break even. And that's assuming you can never win the pot by bluffing on a subsequent street or improving to the best hand. Betting small also allows you to bet profitably with more hands because, again, you're only risking 1/3 of the pot. As a result, your range becomes wider and typically more balanced, which makes it harder for your opponents to pinpoint what you have. You may be wondering, well, when should I use the 1/3 pot size bet? Typically, you want to do so when the board texture is dry, meaning there aren't that many draw possibilities, and when the board favors your range. Let's take a look at an example so I can show you what I mean. You raise pre-flop from early position and you get a call on the button. The flop comes down King 3-2 rainbow and it's on you to act. Now I don't really care what you have specifically, that's not important here. What you need to realize is that this is a good situation for you to bet 1/3 of the pot with your entire range, meaning every hand that you can have. You're betting here because this range favors the pre-flop raiser. Namely, it's easier for you as the pre-flop raiser to have kings, aces, and ace-king. The caller can't have these hands because if he did, he would have 3-bet pre-flop. Therefore, the situation itself warrants a bet from you. You'll choose a 1/3 pot size bet here for 2 reasons. First off, you're not representing that many strong hands when you bet. The strong hands you can have are few, namely big kings like ace-king and pocket aces. And secondly, because you'll want to c-bet your heir as well, something like queen-jack suited or ace-5 suited. So you should choose a small bet sizing so that when you do bet, you can keep those bluffs in your range and still show a profit. Second, there's not many hands your opponent can defend with on this board, so there's no need to bet big here. If he has heir, he'll fold regardless of what size you bet, and on the flip side, if he has a king or a set, he'll continue regardless as well. In short, betting small gives you more options, keeps your range balanced, and allows you to bet more often, thereby maintaining aggression throughout the hand. Use the 1/3 pot size bet move when the board favors your range, and there aren't many hands you are representing, or there aren't many hands your opponent can call with. For more in-depth analysis into bet sizing strategy and when to apply this move, you can check out our membership program at the link in the description below. We're now offering a free trial for a limited time, so be sure to check it out. Move number 3, the overbet. The overbet is quite the opposite of the downbet we discussed before, and when used at the right time, the overbet can be extremely effective. Overbetting simply means to bet more than the size of the pot, and it's a play that's becoming increasingly popular in 2019 because it allows you to apply maximum pressure on your opponents. While mastering the art of the overbet takes practice and constant refinement, of course, there are no hard fast rules. But a general rule of thumb for when you should overbet is when you can have an extremely strong hand based on how the hand was played and your opponent cannot. In this way, you're using what I call range leverage. The idea that your range is stronger than your opponent's to apply maximum pressure and put them to the ultimate test. Here's an example of when an overbet could be an effective strategy using the strategy we just discussed. Let's say your opponent raises preflop from early position and you flat call out of the big blind. The flop comes down 8-8-5 with a flush draw. You check call a 1/3 pot size bet. The turn brings the 4 diamonds and you both check. The river comes at 2 and now the action is on you. Here's an example of an opportune situation to overbet. Notice how I haven't even revealed the cards that we are holding. And that's because you're not playing your hand, you're playing the situation. Great players understand when they have what's called a range advantage, meaning their range is stronger than their opponent's. They use range leverage to apply pressure in these situations. But here's why this play is effective. Let's replay the hand street by street to better understand why this is a favorable situation for us. We'll use what I call a hand range funnel, which is a methodology I invented to help other talented players like yourself pinpoint and narrow down exactly what our opponents are holding. And now we at Conscious Poker have made this available to you absolutely free at the link in the description below, so be sure to download our hand range funnel to learn more about how to hand read like a pro. Now let's take a look at this example to help illustrate why this is a favorable situation to overbet. Our opponent raises preflop from early position, so he's representing mostly big cards and big pairs. We call from the big blind, which we're going to do quite often as we're getting a good price and we close the action. The flop comes down 8-8-5 with a flush draw. The first thing I want you to think is, whose range does this flop favor? Think about it. If you answered ours in the big blind, you'd be right. While of course it's easier for our opponent to have an overpair, it's easier for us to have an 8 or trips. The reason being, there are more 8s in our big blind calling range than there are in the early position's raiser's range. On the flop, we check, he bets 1/3 of the pot, and we call. Again, assuming we're a balanced player, which you are, we can still have an 8 here as well because we would check call the flop with trips to protect our range. The turn comes a 4, completing the flopped flush. Once again, we check, and now our opponent checks behind. This is great news for us because it sets us up for a potential overbet on the river. Why? Because we now have range leverage. Here's why. Our range can still contain all the strong hands, any 8x hand, as well as straights, flushes, and full house, where our opponent really can't have those hands. We can eliminate these hands from his range based on the clear assumption that if our opponent had a set, a straight, or a flush, or a boat on the turn, he would have bet. In other words, the fact that he checked the turn makes his range weak. Sure, I know some players will occasionally check strong hands here for balance, but the vast majority of the time their range will be capped at overpairs or overcards, and that range is extremely vulnerable on this scary board. When the river comes a blank, by betting here, we can rep all those hands that our opponent can't have. Hands like sets, straights, flushes, and boats. It's also a situation where we don't have many bluffs because all the draws got there. In short, our range has the potential to be incredibly strong, whereas our opponent's range is almost always weak. The two of these factors combined makes overbetting a great strategy. While overbetting sizing is another subject for another video, a general rule of thumb is 1.5x to 2x the pot. Overbetting is an advanced play which should be done with caution. To learn more about when to implement this powerful tool into your game, again, check out our membership where we have entire videos dedicated to overbetting, bet sizing, and much, much more. Move number 4, the preflop squeeze. The preflop squeeze simply means to either raise or re-raise preflop, typically with a weaker holding, in an attempt to steal the dead money in the pot. Just like downbetting and overbetting, timing this right is everything, and although it can be a rather simple concept to understand, mastering the preflop squeeze takes practice and finesse. To help you master the art of preflop play, I've put together some preflop charts which tell you which hands to play from which position, along with the quick start guide to preflop play, which tells you exactly how to adjust these charts to your specific game, your opponents, and the unique situation you're in. You can download them for free at the link in the description below. For now though, here are some examples of great times to use the preflop squeeze to your advantage. Number 1 is against limpers. The most common time to use the preflop squeeze is when you see a lot of limpers, aka dead money, and you have a reasonable holding. The key here is choosing hands which are stronger than your opponent's range. Great candidates are hands like King Jack or Ace 10, whereas small suited connectors like 7-6 don't play as well, simply because you never have the best hand pre-flop. Ideal situations to raise are when you're in position and players in your game don't 3-bet often, thereby allowing you to realize your equity by seeing the flop. You may be wondering about sizing. A typical rule of thumb for raise sizing is 3 times the big blind plus 1 additional big blind for every limper. For example, if you're playing 2-5 NL and there are 3 limpers in front of you, you'll want to raise to 15 plus 5 plus 5 plus 5 or $30 pre-flop. One caveat to this rule is if you're out of position because you're in the blinds. In this case, I recommend choosing a slightly bigger sizing, something like 5x the big blind plus 1 big blind for every limper. In the example above, you would have made it 40 instead of 30. The reason being that you're out of position post-flop and you want to reduce your opponent's incentive for calling you pre-flop when they have position. The second best time to use the pre-flop squeeze is when there's a raise from a weaker player and you have 1 or more callers. The callers almost never have premium hands because they would have re-raised themselves if they had anything strong, and if the raiser is a really loose or weak player, chances are he doesn't have a super premium holding either. Choosing these spots correctly is an art which takes practice, but here's a prime example of when you can try and implement a 3-bet squeeze pre-flop to take down the pot. Let's say you're playing 2-5 no limit, and there's a raise in mid position from a weak player to 20. The cutoff and button both call, and you're in the small blind with something like Ace-5 suited. This is not only a great situation to 3-bet because of the factors we discussed earlier, but you also have a great hand to do it with. Suited aces make for good 3-betting hands because you block some of your opponent's most valuable holdings, namely pocket aces, ace-king, and ace-queen, thereby making it more likely they will fold pre-flop. Second, your hand has decent equity when called. Sometimes you may even be ahead when your opponent calls with king-queen or suited rundown, for example, and if you're behind, your straight and flush draws will be live. Other great candidates for 3-betting pre-flop are big Broadway cards, especially when suited. Of course, you'll also be 3-betting your premium hands like big pairs and ace-king and ace-queen, but throwing in some strong bluffs makes your range more balanced and you make yourself more difficult to play against. The weaker your opponents and the more confident you are with your post-flop game, the wider you can afford to 3-bet pre-flop and still show a profit. You may be wondering about sizing for your squeeze. Again, you can use something similar to the rule we discussed before. Make it 3 times the original raise size plus 1 raise for each caller. In this case, since the original raise was 20, you'd make it 60 plus 20 for each caller. Therefore, you'd make it 60 plus 20 plus 20 or 100 pre-flop. And just like in the previous example, you can add 1 additional raise size when you're out of position and make it 120 to go. And what if your squeeze gets called pre-flop? Well, you can use the down bet we talked about earlier as an effective post-flop strategy to give yourself a great price post-flop to win the pot with a continuation bet. When you combine this 3-bet squeeze with a 1/3 pot size bet post-flop, it's an effective winning combination. Move number 5, when to quit. Just like knowing when to sit down, knowing when to quit a poker game is one of the key factors to make you a long-term winner. We've all experienced the frustration when we stay too long and end up losing, and there's nothing worse than getting buried in a game you shouldn't have been in the first place. While one can quit a game for many reasons, here are a few good ones to consider. First, when the game gets too tough. Each time a player quits or a new one sits down, reevaluate how good your game is. Check your ego at the door and be humble. If you aren't one of the top 5 players in the game, chances are you should walk away. Number 2 is when you're losing. I recommend that every player adopt a stop loss, a fixed amount which, if you lose, you'll quit the game. A good rule of thumb is 3 buy-ins. In working with and coaching countless clients over the years, I can say with confidence that almost every player is better off with a stop loss, and even those who think they can play well when they're losing often can't. Implementing a stop loss ahead of time helps you make rational decisions and prevents emotion from clouding your judgment. A good way to ensure you'll actually stick to your stop loss is only bring what you can afford to lose at the casino and leave any ATM or credit cards at home. Number 3 is consider quitting the game if you've been playing longer than 6 to 8 hours. While many experienced players can play longer sessions, especially if you're training or in good shape, it's important to recognize that playing poker well is a mentally taxing task, and many experience fatigue when playing longer sessions. This will ultimately lead to suboptimal decision making, which can cost you that hard-earned money. Perhaps one of the most frustrating things you can experience in poker is playing well for hours on end, only to lose all that hard-earned profits back at the end of the session. Find out the amount of time you can play your A game and quit 30 minutes before the clock is up. Number 4, and the only reason you ever need to quit a game, is you no longer feel like playing or poker isn't your number 1 priority. There's no shame in picking up and calling it a day. If there's anything I've learned in my 15 years of playing, it's that the game will be there tomorrow. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button, and I'd greatly appreciate it if you could share it. Subscribe to our channel because there's more awesome content coming your way, and I'll see you guys next time. Cheers.